The call came in at 11:14 on a Thursday morning in April, and Dr. Beto Salcedo took it while he was still charting from his last patient. Salcedo: "This is the Mesa Verde Archaeological Cooperative. We have a situation at the Rio Hondo excavation site. Flash flood advisory came through 40 minutes ago. We had a team still in the field. The East Kiva Trench collapsed. We have 2 people in the pit. Access road is flooded. We can't get emergency vehicles in." Beto put down his pen. "How deep is the trench?" "Approximately 4 meters. One researcher was in the lower tier when the south wall went. She may have taken impact. We can't see her from above. Anyone on site with medical training?" "The principal investigator was up at the rim survey when it happened. He came back on foot. He's a professor, he's not medical." "What's the fastest route in on foot?" A pause, the kind that happens when someone is asking for a map instead of reassurance, and the person on the other end isn't used to that. "There's a trail access off the canyon road, about half a mile east of the flooded section. You'd have to cross an arroyo. It's running, but I think it's passable." Beto was already standing. "I think is not good enough. Get me the field director's direct number and tell whoever is at the rim to stay on the line with me. I'm leaving in 4 minutes." He hung up, grabbed his field kit from the supply cabinet, the one he'd been keeping stocked since he started covering rural emergency calls 3 years ago, the one that lived in the back of his truck specifically for the moments when the situation came to him faster than any ambulance could. He told his nurse where he was going. He was in his truck in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He'd been working emergency medicine at the Taos Indian Health Service clinic for 6 years. Before that, 2 years at a trauma center in Albuquerque. Before that, medical school in San Juan, which was where he'd grown up. He was 38 years old, and he had spent most of those years in rooms where something had already gone wrong, and the question was only how wrong. He knew how to drive toward that. He'd never learned how to do anything else. The canyon road turned to rust-colored mud 3 miles out, and he pushed the truck through it until the arroyo crossing came into view. A shallow desert watercourse that was, in April, no longer shallow. It was running brown and fast from 3 days of late-season snowmelt off the Sangre de Cristo range. The kind of runoff that appeared in the high desert without much warning and disappeared the same way. He assessed it. It was crossable. He crossed it. On the other side, a man was coming down the trail toward him at a pace that was almost running, but not quite. The pace of someone who had decided that running would waste energy they needed for talking. The first thing Beto noticed about Jonah Hsu was that he was carrying a notebook, not a phone. A physical notebook, spiral-bound, tucked under his left arm, even now, mud on the cover, still there. Taiwanese-American, maybe mid-30s, lean in the way of someone who spent real time in the field rather than gesturing at it from conference rooms. He had the kind of dark eyes that were already calculating when they found Beto's, and a small cut above his right eyebrow from something, a branch, a rock, something in the scramble back from the rim that he clearly hadn't had time to notice yet. "Salcedo," he said. Not a question. "Hsu. Sophia is the one in the lower tier. She's conscious. She was responding verbally 20 minutes ago. I have a student relaying messages down." The south wall came down on the east side of the trench, not directly on her, but the impact was close. Possible shoulder injury. She says her arm isn't working right. The second person is Tomas. He was on the upper tier. He's mobile and uninjured, but he can't get to her from where he is because the debris is blocking the connect passage. He said all of this in one continuous sentence, like a man who had been rehearsing it on the way down the trail and was not going to waste a single word of it. Beto liked him immediately and didn't have time to do anything with that information. "What's the structural situation?" he said, starting up the trail. "Is the trench still moving?" Jonah fell in beside him, matching pace without being asked. The primary collapse was the south wall. "I don't think the east or west walls are compromised. I was looking at the soil stratification there all week. Both walls are sitting on consolidated caliche. The debris in the trench is mostly loose fill, archaeological matrix, and one significant piece of timber framing from the kiva roof structure. Beto glanced at him sideways. You know soil stratification. I've been excavating this site for 4 years. The way he said it was not defensive. It was simply information, like the rest of what he'd said. I know every layer of that trench. If you need to know what's load-bearing and what's loose, I'm what you have. Then I need you with me, Beto said. At the rim, something moved in Jonah's expression, just briefly. The way a light changes when a cloud shifts, and then it was composed again. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Asterisk, the site was a controlled chaos that had stopped being controlled. The Rio Hondo Kiva excavation was, under normal circumstances, a meticulous world of gridded string lines, trowels, and brushes. 4 years of careful work uncovering the remains of a 900-year-old ancestral Puebloan ceremonial structure in the canyon wall above the river. In the photograph on the university's project page, which Beto had pulled up on his phone on the way out of town, it looked like the kind of place where people moved slowly and spoke quietly, respectful of what they were inside. Now the East Trench had a hole where the south wall used to be. A debris cone of tan and ochre soil covering the lower access passage, and a cluster of 5 graduate students at the rim doing the specific kind of nothing that happens when people want to act and have been told not to. One of them was holding a cell phone down into the trench on the end of a length of survey tape. The way you lower a line to someone in a well? From below, faintly, Beto could hear a voice. He crouched at the rim and looked in. The lower tier was maybe 2.5 meters below him, visible in patches through the debris, which had mostly fallen toward the east wall and created a slope rather than a complete blockage. In the northwest corner, which was the only part of the lower tier still fully clear, a woman in a field vest was sitting, with her back against the caliche wall and her right arm held against her chest in the specific way of someone whose shoulder had been insulted and was now communicating that fact. Continuously, she looked up when his shadow fell across the rim. "Hey," she said. Her voice was steady. "You the doctor?" "Yeah, I'm Beto. Can you tell me where it hurts?" "Shoulder. Right shoulder. I heard something when the wall came down. I don't think it's broken, but I also don't know. I've never broken anything." "Can you feel your fingers?" She wiggled the fingers of her right hand, slowly, with visible effort. "Yes, it hurts to do that, but I can feel them." "Good." He was mapping the debris slope as she talked, the angle of it, the stability of what he could see, the piece of timber Jonah had mentioned. It was a significant piece, maybe 60 centimeters diameter, sitting athwart the eastern passage with soil piled on top of it. Between Sophia's position and the timber, there was a narrow corridor of open space along the west wall. "Sophia, I need you to tell me if anything around you has moved in the last 20 minutes. "Nothing's moved," she said. It got very quiet about 10 minutes after it happened. "I've been watching." He believed her. She was a field archaeologist. She watched things, for a living. He stood and turned to Jonah. They walked 15 feet from the trench edge. Not for privacy, but for space to think without the students watching every expression on their faces. "The timber," Beto said. "Can it be moved?" Jonah's jaw tightened slightly, not hesitation, recalculation. "It depends what's sitting on it. There's about 40 centimeters of matrix on top, but underneath that timber is the northeast corner of the original kiva wall. 9th century masonry. It's been exposed for 2 seasons. He paused. "If the timber is acting as a bridge holding that corner section up from below, and I think it might be, moving it incorrectly destabilizes the corner, and we lose the west wall." "And Sophia is in the northwest corner?" "Yes." Beto looked at him steadily. "So we need to know whether it's load-bearing before we touch it." "I can tell from visual inspection. I need to get to the east rim of the lower tier. There's a secondary access ladder that might still be usable." If the upper rungs are buried, I can go down the debris slope with a rope. You're not going down that slope alone. Jonah looked at him. You're a doctor, not a... I've done confined space extractions in field conditions 3 times. I know how to move in a tight space without pulling anything down on myself. Beto held his gaze. More importantly, if Sophia's shoulder is a dislocation, someone needs to stabilize it before she moves at all. I have to get to her regardless. A beat. Jonah looked back at the trench, then at Beto. Then he said something Beto had not expected. I'm glad you're here. Just that. No performance in it. The kind of statement that arrives when someone has been handling something alone and suddenly isn't. Let's go, Beto said. The secondary ladder was half buried, but usable. Jonah went first, testing each rung before weighting it. And Beto came down behind him with his field kit strapped to his back and one eye on the debris slope the whole way. The lower tier smelled like wet clay and spring, cold, mineral, the ancient earth smell of a place that had been underground for 1,000 years and was surprised to be open to the sky. Even now, even in the emergency of it, Beto noticed that smell and filed it somewhere. Sophia was 8 feet from the base of the ladder, still in the corner. Still watching. Anterior shoulder, Beto said as soon as he was close enough to look at her properly. The way she was holding it, the slight forward pitch, the way her arm wouldn't cross her midline. Can I touch it? Please, she said, which struck him as very polite for someone who'd been sitting in a collapsed trench for 40 minutes. He worked through the assessment methodically, range of motion. Neurovascular? The specific tests that told him what he needed to know about where the joint was and where it wasn't supposed to be. Anterior dislocation, as he'd thought. No fracture he could identify by palpation, no vascular compromise. She needed reduction, which she was not going to get down here. But she needed immobilization first. I'm going to put a sling on this, and I need you to breathe through the next 60 seconds, he said. I'm a desert archaeologist, she said. I have a high tolerance for discomfort and a low tolerance for being talked to like I'm frightened. Then I'll skip the reassurance. Hold still. She did, while he worked. He was aware of Jonah behind him, crouching at the east face of the debris cone, looking at the timber. Not talking, not narrating. Just looking, with the total concentrated attention of a man reading something complicated in a language only he spoke. Beto, Jonah said quietly. Yeah, it's load-bearing. The corner section is sitting on it. If we pull the timber, the corner goes. How much of the west wall does the corner support? A pause. In normal conditions, it would be stable. The caliche is solid. But the ground is saturated right now. The moisture content up here is not what this site was designed for. Another pause, the kind Beto was starting to learn, meant he was being precise rather than slow. I can't tell you it's safe. Beto finished the sling, checked Sophia's fingers again, sat back on his heels. He thought about the differential the way he thought about differentials in medicine, not what's the most dramatic answer, but what's the most likely one, and what does it require of you? Sophia, he said, can you move on your own? If I clear a path along the west wall, can you walk to the ladder? I can walk, she said. I've been sitting here by choice, not necessity. I know. He looked at the west wall. The corridor along it was narrow, maybe 60, 70 centimeters, and the debris at the north end was loose but not unstable. He'd have to move some of it by hand to widen the path. Carefully. The kind of careful that took time he wasn't sure they had. He looked at Jonah. Jonah was looking at him. He had the notebook open. When had he opened the notebook? And he'd sketched the trench cross-section from memory. The timber and the corner and the west wall. The way an architect would sketch a building they'd designed themselves. He turned it so Beto could see. Here, he said, pointing with his pen. The debris at the north end is archaeological matrix, no structural value. You can move it. But this section, he tapped the sketch, has a piece of original wall stone in it, 2 courses high. It's not going anywhere on its own, but if you lean on it getting past, it could trigger a slide against the timber. So I work around it. You'll need to go sideways. There's about 40 centimeters of clearance if you flatten against the west wall. Beto looked at the clearance. He looked at Jonah. You measured that from memory. I've been inside this trench hundreds of times. Something in Jonah's expression, the same controlled quality it always had, but with something underneath it now, something that had come loose in the last 20 minutes. This is my site. I know it. Beto heard what was in those 4 words. Not just professional ownership. Something more than that, the specific grief of watching a place you love get hurt, and the specific helplessness of being the person who knows it best and still not being able to stop it. He held Jonah's gaze for exactly 1 second, longer than the situation required. Guide me through it, he said. Every step. It took 22 minutes to move Sophia from the northwest corner to the base of the ladder. Beto went first, clearing the path 1 careful armful at a time. Archaeological matrix, cold and damp and surprisingly heavy, piled to the side with the methodical patience of someone who had learned in medical school that the speed of a procedure was not the same as the quality of it. Jonah talked him through every obstacle from behind, this stone, around it. This section, lean left. This part is stable. You can move faster here. The voice was steady throughout, precise. Never once said, I think, when it meant I know. And never said, I know, when it meant I think. Beto began to trust the distinction the way he trusted the difference between a patient who said it hurts and one who said it really hurts. The calibration inside it dot when the path was clear. Sophia walked it herself, right arm in the sling, left hand trailing the west wall for balance, with the deliberate, unhurried composure of someone who had already decided she was going to be fine and was simply executing on that decision dot at the base of the ladder. She looked at Beto. You're good at this, she said. So are you, he said. She climbed. Tomas came down from the upper tier and helped her off the top rung. From above, the sound of the graduate students, the specific sound of 5 people, who had been holding their breath for 22 minutes, releasing it all at once. Beto stood at the base of the ladder and looked at the trench. At the timber, still in place. At the corner, still standing. At the debris slope with the path cut through it, which looked, he thought, like a record of the last half hour. He heard Jonah behind him. She's out, Jonah said. She's out. A silence. The kind that comes after the thing that needed doing has been done, and the body doesn't know yet that it's allowed to stop. The corner held, Beto said. It held. Jonah was quiet for a moment. I wasn't certain it would. Beto turned around. Jonah was standing 5 feet away with his notebook still in his hand, and mud on both knees from where he'd crouched to guide Beto through the debris, and the cut above his eyebrow had bled a little while they were working. Not much. Just enough to track a thin line down toward his temple that he still hadn't noticed. You have a cut, Beto said. Jonah reached up and touched the side of his head. Looked at his fingers. I should look at it. It's not serious. I'm aware. I still should look at it. He held out a hand, not to help him, just indicating the ladder. Up. The afternoon had gone golden by the time Sophia was loaded into the county medical transport. Road passable again once the arroyo dropped, which it did with the same casual suddenness with which it had risen. Anterior shoulder reduction in the field, which Beto performed while she looked at the sky and said 3 words he was fairly certain were not English, and which she later said was the worst 40 seconds of her life, and which had her arm working again before the transport arrived. The graduate students had gone. Tomas had gone with Sophia. The site was quiet. Beto sat on a flat sandstone ledge at the canyon rim and did what he always did after the acute phase of something. He sat still and let his nervous system figure out it was allowed to do that. The canyon below was running full and brown, the Rio Hondo doing its April thing, and the light was the particular warm ochre of late afternoon in northern New Mexico, the kind that made the cliff walls look like they were glowing from inside. He heard Jonah coming before he saw him, not heavy steps, Just the specific sound of someone who knew the terrain under their feet. Jonah sat down on the ledge. Not far. He had a clean bandage above his eyebrow now, which meant at some point in the last hour he'd found the first aid kit in the site trailer and done it himself, quietly, without saying anything. The notebook was in his hands again, closed this time, not open. He was looking at the canyon. How long has this site been yours? Beto asked. I started as a junior researcher under the previous PI 8 years ago. Took over as principal investigator 4 years ago. He paused. I've spent more nights in that canyon than in my own apartment. What were you studying? Before today? Ceremonial use patterns. The spatial relationship between the kiva structure and the water source. He looked at the river below. There's a theory, fairly well supported, that the placement of the kiva was deliberate, oriented toward the spring floodline. The community that built this understood the river as something that gave and took on a cycle, and they built their sacred spaces in relationship to that cycle rather than protected from it. Beto considered that. And today the river flooded the kiva. Yes, a quiet beat. I thought about that. What did you conclude? Jonah turned and looked at him. There was something different about his face now than there had been at the bottom of the trench. Not open, exactly, but less managed. The way a place looks when the work crew has gone home and it doesn't have to be ready for anyone. That the people who built this understood something I'm still trying to, he said. That the site and the forces acting on it are the same story. You don't study them separately. Beto looked at him. You think like a doctor. How so? We call it differential diagnosis. The presenting problem isn't the whole picture. What the body is doing is inseparable from what happened to it and what it was before. He paused. Most people think medicine is about fixing things. It's more about reading things. Jonah was quiet for a moment. Most people think archaeology is about finding things. What is it? Listening. He looked back at the canyon. To what's left? The ochre light was on both of them now, the way it fell in the late afternoon on that specific rim, warm and specific, choosing. Below them, the river ran on. From inside the canyon came the smell of wet adobe and sage and the cold particular breath of the trench, which was still open to the sky, the timber still in place, the corner still standing. The corner is going to need documentation before we shore it up, Jonah said. The moisture event may have shifted the alignment. I'll need to do a new stratigraphic read on the south wall once it dries. How long will that take? Weeks, maybe longer. He turned the notebook over in his hands. The university will want a full incident. Report, insurance, structural review. He said all of this in the flat tone of a man describing things he found much less interesting than the thing he'd rather be talking about. Beto watched him. The site's not lost. Beto said, No. A breath quietly out. No, it's not. The corner held. Jonah looked at him. You keep saying that, because I think you need to hear it more than once. Beto held his gaze. The thing you built your work on is still there. That's not a small thing. Something moved in Jonah's expression, the same thing Beto had caught at the base of the ladder. The thing that had come loose during the 22 minutes in the trench when Jonah's voice had been the most reliable thing in the room. Not fragility. Something more specific than that. The particular vulnerability of a person who has held something together for a long time being told, simply that it's okay to stop holding. He looked down at the notebook in his hands. He didn't say anything for a moment. I cited your clinic in my project emergency protocols, he said. After the 2022 Arroyo incident, the one where the state researcher had the allergic reaction in the field, I looked up the closest IHS facility with field-capable emergency response, and it was yours. I put your number in the protocol document. Beto blinked. I've had that protocol. I've read it. I know. You updated the Arroyo crossing assessment last year. The county sent it to all rural field teams. He paused. You changed the crossing threshold to account for snowmelt volume rather than just rainfall rate. The rainfall rate metric was too conservative for spring conditions. It was, you were right. Something close to a smile in Jonah's voice, if not quite on his face. I updated my own field protocols after I read yours. Beto stared at him. You've been using my updated arroyo assessment. For 8 months? Yes, you crossed that arroyo today. I did. Using my threshold, it was accurate. Now there was something on Jonah's face, brief and real. You said it was passable. It was, Beto laughed, a short, genuine sound, the kind that escapes before you decide to let it. It surprised him. Jonah looked at it like it surprised him too, not unpleasantly. They sat for a moment in the long light. There's a place in town, Beto said, on Ben Street. Green chili that'll make you understand why I haven't left Taos in 6 years. Jonah looked at the canyon for a beat, then at Beto. I have to do a site walk before I go. I need to see what's intact. How long? 30 minutes if everything looks the way I think it does. He paused. Less if it looks better. I'll wait, Beto said. Jonah looked at him, a long, careful look. The same quality of attention he'd given the timber in the trench, the corner section, the debris slope. The kind of attention that doesn't make assumptions, that reads what's actually there rather than what's expected. You don't have to, he said. I know. Beto looked at the canyon, at the light moving slowly down the cliff walls the way it did every evening, the ochre deepening to copper. I want to see it when you see it. Jonah was quiet. Then, the site. Yeah, Beto said. The site. He didn't say anything else. Neither did Jonah. Below them, the Rio Hondo ran on toward the valley, carrying spring with it, snowmelt and clay, and the bright particular cold of water that had been ice 2 weeks ago and was now just itself again, moving through the canyon the way it had been moving for 1,000 years, the way it would keep moving. Long after the caliche walls had given, back to the earth and the kiva was a memory in the soil and the names carved in no record anyone could read. Jonah stood and went to walk his site. Beto stayed on the ledge and watched the river and waited.